This is Doug Voisard. Good afternoon. Glad that all of you could join us on the conference call here this afternoon. I have with me Brian McClard, who is our Chief Investment Officer of the firm. And to say the least, the markets over the last week have been a little bit challenging and a little bit volatile, to say the least. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time sharing with you our thoughts on the recent downgrade and really the bottom line of the whole issue, which is the debt of the United States, and talk a little bit in terms of what our position of the portfolio is and how we're approaching the current issues at hand. A couple of housekeeping things. If you signed up when you signed on with the voice over internet, if you want to ask a question, you'll need a microphone to do that. So if you don't have a microphone and you're still listening over the computer, you can type a question in the question box on your dashboard, which should be on your screens. If you do want to ask a question, if you want to raise your hand, there's a button called Raise Your Hand. If you do that, I'll unmute it and we will type your question in. You know, preferably at the end of the presentation, but if you want to, feel it's appropriate to go ahead and ask a question during. We've got a lot of flexibility here. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll get started. For today, what we're going to take a look at is the Standard & Poor's downgrade of the U.S. debt, what the real and potential impact to investors are. Just an overview of the government debt. This is something that we've been writing about in our commentaries for probably the last 12 to 18 months. So it's not a new topic, but we do want to touch on that for a moment. A little bit about market valuations and how this looks in terms of historical perspective and current earnings versus prices in the market. The portfolio structure, how we addressed these things in the past and how are we looking at them going forward. And then certainly we want to open this up to questions and comments that you might have, or anything that you want to chat about respective to the topic. When we look at just the rating agency changes that were made, I mean, S&P changed the long-term rating only from AAA to the AA+. And AA+ is just one notch below AAA, and it still represents a very strong capacity to repay debt. It's still of investment grade, it's very high quality, but it's one notch below the top. Now, that is the long-term rating. S&P did maintain the short-term rating of A1+, which in that case it's a little different rating system, but it is the highest short-term rating. So there's really no question about the United States paying our bills in the short term. It's really more the medium and longer term issues that S&P is trying to address. Moody's and Fitch are two other rating agencies. They both maintain their AAA long-term ratings, and there was no changes with their positions on that. So why does the rating matter? I mean, it's an opinion of S&P, and it matters because it really, S&P is a very nationally recognized organization, but it's really there to help and assist investors with identifying the risk and the return that they should get from a particular kind of investment, whether it's treasury debt or mortgage backs or corporate bonds. It really just helps them in identifying the risk and assigning the return. Plus, the U.S. debt is a basis for a lot of other rates, and that might be like your home equities or mortgages, maybe a vehicle loan, although not as maybe a little more loosely in that case. But it is the basis for other rates that we experience in the economy. Now, S&P has taken a lot of criticism for changing their rating, and I'm sure you've heard probably about the $2 trillion mistake and the ability of the United States to print money. So why would we ever default on our debt? But nonetheless, it's their opinion, and they may be making up ground for some of the other ratings that they've done during the mortgage crisis a few years ago. That they're just trying to be ahead of the curve. which is not wrong, but again, they're taking a lot of heat for the change in the rating. Now, what we've kind of called this is, and I've seen this before, really a known unknown. I mean, the downgrade, while it's unprecedented, it really wasn't unexpected. I mean, we all know the status of government finances. It's public information. And even back in April of 2011, S&P warned that, if the United States doesn't move on addressing their debt, there's a potential for a downgrade. So while all that was going on, to me, I think there's a few things that kind of tip the scales maybe for S&P to move forward on that, and one is the political gridlock that we saw during the debt ceiling debates. I mean, we went all the way to the 11th hour. I think a lot of people were very nervous about it. They were frustrated at their legislators for not, getting something done, not compromising, and, ultimately, the debt reduction agreement that they put in place was really small. It was really much smaller than anticipated. And so I think when you add those things together, I think it made it easier for S&P to move forward to get a downgrade, because they really believed that the political system wasn't working as good as what it should. One other known that we saw, this was back in December of 2010, is that PIMCO, which is a bond fund that many of you hold, sold out of all of their U.S. debt. They didn't feel like the risk-return relationship was adequate enough for them to hold treasuries, and it was a pretty big deal. I mean, it caught a lot of eyeballs in terms of what they were doing within their portfolio. So a lot of this stuff was known. It's just now that you've got S&P that someone actually put the line down and said, "Yep, we're going to downgrade it," and that's what they did. Why does this downgrade really matter? I mean, I think one thing it does is it's decreased the consumer investor confidence. I mean, I think we saw that through the volatility of the last few days. I'm not sure that I've ever seen 5 out of the last 6 days with 400 and 500 point swings up and down. It increases the rates potentially in some of your other mortgages and borrowing rates. The higher interest rates really, it kind of chokes off some of the economic growth, or it has the potential to choke off some economic growth. And if the rates go up, then the debt service of the United States becomes higher as that debt is rolled over. So it has a lot of sidelines. The challenge that we see in the market right now is nobody really knows how those different options or those different avenues might play out. Right now, really, it's too soon that any of them have played out. But it also makes the markets wonder, what about the other sovereign governments like France and Greece and some of the other governments that have been in the news, for quite a long time now? We're really the big gorilla in the room, and if our debt is at risk, what does that mean for the world? So it really just kind of, they're making some correlations with some of the other countries around the world. So when I look at this, the biggest issue is not really the downgrade itself, at least in my opinion. I mean, the downgrade does matter, but it's really not the downgrade. It's really what's underneath the downgrade, which is, the debt piece. How are we going to look at and how are we going to address the debt that our country has incurred and continues to incur? So we want to spend a few minutes on the government debt piece and what that looks like.
Right, because at the heart of the whole downgrade is really the mounting debt that our country continues to incur. And I think what helps put the path of debt into perspective is really the chart we have here on this page. What we show here is since 1980, the gross public debt relative to GDP. And we can see how, as a percentage of GDP, our debt has actually increased at a faster rate than the growth of our country. And you can see how even more so in just the recent years, it has expanded at a more rapid pace, which is increasingly worrisome. So even though the level of the debt has been a major topic of conversation in the papers recently with the debt ceiling. What has been equally as dangerous has been the rate at which the debt has accelerated. And much of the acceleration in recent years has really been driven by, number one, the wars that we have been involved with and the defense spending, but also more recently also to the fiscal stimulus that we have injected into the economy in order to try to make up for the deleveraging that the private sector took on whenever the market turned down in 2008. To put this into perspective, we've put on this chart here the U.S., which you'll see in the upper left corner of this chart in the red circle there, versus other countries. And along the vertical Y scale, we have the net debt to GDP. And you'll notice that this isn't 100% here. This is closer to 76 to 80%, because there are different metrics that are reported for how debt is calculated. But this debt only includes the debt held by public institutions, private investors, and the like. It does not include the debt that is held by the government. And of course, additionally, it does not include the promises to Medicare and Medicaid and those types of things. So that's the reason this number is not at 100%, it's lower. But also it shows that the debt service, the cost to the annual budget on the horizontal scale, the x-axis there, is around 10%. So not only as a percentage of our GDP is our debt high, but also in terms of just our annual budget, just servicing this debt has really taken on mammoth proportions. And there it is compared to the other AAA-rated countries. And you can see that we have really traveled far beyond what the other countries have relative to their GDPs. And so it makes you wonder, of course, should we have even been rated AAA to begin with?
You know, and when we take a look at all this, you know, really those kind of statistics are really it's a big wake-up call to our legislators. I mean, they really ultimately have to address the deficit spending and the revenue intake of the country. I mean, we know that that's what they need to do. In this latest round of the debt ceiling raising, they pushed out much of the major decisions to December of this year, and ultimately we believe that's the next challenge. All of the 12 members have been named, and they have until December 2nd to submit to the President and Congress their list of recommendations. You know, by December 23rd they have to vote, and if they can't come to an agreement on January 15th, some of the mandatory triggers as far as the cost reductions go into place, and that's to the tune of about $1.2 trillion. So I think when we get to December, hopefully I'm wrong on this, but I think we'll see some, you know, political maneuvering and a lot of discussion similar to what we saw, you know, just here lately.